Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. The third of the sketches or examples that Camus is providing to us in the second part of his work, The Myth of Sisyphus, illustrating different potential ethics of quantity, is titled Conquest, and it is about the conqueror. But there's a very interesting set of twists that Camus is going to bring to this topic. What we might imagine, particularly with the, beginning with Don Juanism, focusing on Don Juan, is we're going to look at people who are, in fact, conquerors or adventurers, and that's where they're placing their ideas. And Camus is going to say, well, conquerors live in a different world now, a different configuration, if they are actually using their intelligence than they had been in the past. There are certain possibilities that have been, we might say, closed off. So he's going to begin with this address or discourse in quotes from the conqueror. And the conqueror says, "Don't assume that because I love action, I've forgotten how to think. On the contrary, I can thoroughly define what I believe. I believe it firmly. I see it surely and clearly." And he goes on and says, "I don't have many opinions. At the end of a life, a person notices they've spent years becoming sure of a single truth. But a single truth, if it's obvious, that's enough to guide an existence. As for me, I decidedly have something to say about the individual. One must speak of him bluntly and, if need be, with the appropriate contempt." And then he goes on and says, "A person is more a person through the things they keep to themselves than those which they say. There are many things I shall keep to myself. But I firmly believe all those who have judged the individual have done so with less experience than we on which to base their judgment." So what is going to be his judgment of the individual? He's going to contrast our modern era with earlier times. So he says, it was possible for ancient nations, and even for more recent ones down to our age, to weigh one against the other, virtues of society, so something acknowledged as social, and the individual, and which would take priority, which would serve the other, as he says. And he says that that was possible by virtue of that stubborn aberration in man's heart, according to which human beings were created to serve or be served. There's a kind of motif that runs throughout human relations and connections that creates a hierarchy, that asserts one over the other. One will serve, one will be served. One will rule, one will be ruled. But he points out another important feature as well. It was possible to have this conflict between the virtues of society and the individual and trying to figure it out. Why? Because neither society nor the individual had yet revealed all their ability. We live in a time when we can't say that society and the human individual have revealed all of their capacities, but we know a lot more now than we did then. Things have become more interconnected. And he talks about a seeming contradiction between what he calls secular turmoils and eternal values. And he gives you a few examples. I've seen bright minds express astonishment at the masterpieces of Dutch painters born at the height of bloody wars in Flanders. I've been amazed by the prayers of Cilician mystics brought up during the frightful 30 Years' War. So these were some really devastating battles and wars that were going on. And yet, people could paint these beautiful religious themes or write about their religious experiences in the very heart of that. Is that still available to us now? I mean, some people do withdraw from society into their dreams or hopes or things like that. But he uses terms like our modern age, our machine age, our mobilized age. And, this is coming after a World War I, World War II took a long time to develop, and all sorts of atrocities were taking place as well. And there's an uncertain future that, runs ahead of us, you could say, in our own time. And we haven't actually finished up with this, right? There are people who, when, for example, the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union, broke up into different nations and the Velvet Revolution happened and Eastern Europe was freed of Warsaw Pact and the Soviet yoke. And there were people who were like, end of history. Everything is going to be great going forward from now on. Is that the case? No. And so Camus is talking about our time just as much as his time. He says the painters of today are deprived of such serenity. Even if they have the heart the Creator needs, a closed heart, it's of no use. For everyone, including the saint himself, is mobilized at every form that miscarries in the trenches, every outline, metaphor, or prayer, crushed under steel. The eternal loses around. And then here's where the conqueror is going to commit himself. Conscious I cannot stand aloof from my time, I've decided to be an integral part of it. So this is going to be a different kind of conqueror. This is why I esteem the individual, because he strikes me as ridiculous and humiliated. Knowing there are no victorious causes, I have a liking for lost causes. They require an uncontaminated soul, equal to its defeat as to its temporary victories. And he goes on to say, for anyone who feels bound up with this world's fate, the clash of civilizations has something agonizing about it. I have made that anguish mine, and at the same time, I wanted to join in. Between history and the eternal, or contemplation and action, I have actually made my choice. I've chosen history because I like certainties. I can be certain of it, and I can't deny this force crushing me. Choosing between contemplation and action, he says, this is called becoming a man. These wrenches are dreadful, but for a proud heart there can be no compromise. There is God or this time, the eternal or history, the cross or the sword. This world has a higher meaning that transcends its worries, its concerns, its anguish, or nothing is true but those worries. I will go with those worries. And he says that, you can compromise and live in the world while believing in the eternal. That's called accepting. Lots of people do that. That's not for me. I refuse to do that. I want all or nothing. If I choose action, don't think that contemplation is an unknown country to me, but it cannot give me everything, and deprived of the eternal, I want to ally myself with time, he says. So we get a picture of a very different sort of conqueror, and then the next section, he begins by saying, conquerors know that action is in itself useless. So why do they devote themselves to action? He says there's only one useful action, and it is remaking man and the earth. And then he says, I'll never remake man. I'll never change human nature, or you could say fundamentally reorder society or the relations between countries or anything like that. That's not going to happen. But I must act as if. I can still do things. Those are not bereft of meaning altogether. Even if I can't change the trajectory of history. It's not going to have some, guaranteed eternal meaning to the things that I do, but I have to behave as if. I have to commit myself. He says, even humiliated, the flesh is my only certainty. I can live only on it. This is why I have chosen this absurd and ineffectual effort. This is why I'm on the side of the struggle. The epic lends itself to this. And again, he's going to make a really important contrast between previous conquerors and the conqueror of the present. He says, before, the greatness of a conqueror was geographical. It was measured by the extent of the conquered territories. There's a reason why the word has changed in meaning and ceased to signify the victorious general. The conqueror is no longer Alexander the Great, conquering the entire Persian Empire, pushing all the way to the boundaries of India, being stopped there, coming back to Babylon. Ooh, he dies. What a shame. What would he have accomplished if he had lived? Well, just more territories. He wouldn't have changed human nature. As a matter of fact, he was trying to do some sort of interesting project of fusing Greek and Persian culture together. But let's say he'd succeeded in that. Let's say he'd lived to 60 and started diplomatic relations between his massive empire, which hadn't broken up into successor states, and the Indian states that he was engaged in. Or he'd even gone west and conquered Rome or something like that. Well, great. But that's irrelevant for the present. We can have people who want to conquer. They can conquer in terms of land. They can conquer by being CEOs of mega corporations that buy up all of their competitors. That's not what Camus is talking about here. So what does the conqueror actually look like? He says, greatness has changed camp. It lies in protest and the blind alley sacrifice. It's not through a preference for defeat. This is not being sad, pitying oneself, taking on the role of the loser or anything like that. No, it's trying to do something, but realizing the conditions in which one works. He says victory would be desirable, but there's only one victory and it's eternal. I'm not going to have that. Nobody's going to have that, frankly. And so he talks about revolution. He uses the example of Prometheus. A revolution is always accomplished against the gods, the eternal, beginning with the revolution of Prometheus, the first of modern conquerors. You might say, well, how the hell is Prometheus a modern conqueror? First of all, he doesn't exist. He's a made-up, Greek god. We don't believe in any of that stuff today. And even if he did exist, he would exist way back then in ancient times. Well, he's eminently modern because he does revolt, even knowing that his revolt is not going to be successful. And he doesn't revolt just to be a jerk or to stir things up. He revolts in favor of humankind who the gods are not behaving towards as they should. He gives them fire to help them out. So he goes on and he says that I can seize the spirit of the time only in its historical act. That's where I make contact with it. And he says, don't assume I take pleasure in it. Opposite the eternal contradiction, or the essential contradiction, I maintain my human contradiction. So there's more than one kind of contradiction in play. This is what later on Camus will call metaphysical revolt, right? So maintaining the human contradiction through revolt, through not placing a sort of a value in hope for something better to come along, acting in the present. He talks about lucidity here at this point. He says that I establish my lucidity in the midst of what negates it. I exalt man before what crushes him. My freedom, my revolt, my passion come together then in that tension, that lucidity, and that vast repetition. Then he talks about vanquishing and overcoming. So, old school conquerors would vanquish, overcome other nations, perhaps the people struggling with power in their own nation. They take it over. They become the ruler. And Camus says, well, I mean, people still do that today, but true vanquishing or overcoming now is of oneself. He says, every man has felt himself to be the equal of God at certain moments, but this comes from the fact that in a flash he felt the amazing grandeur of the human mind. The conquerors are merely those among men who are conscious enough of their strength to be sure of living constantly on those heights and fully aware of that grandeur. They are capable of more, but they are capable of no more than man himself when he wants. So they never leave the human crucible, he says. They don't become gods, right? And here he'll talk about transitory riches. We can experience riches within action, within this life, but they're always going to be just of a certain time. He says that there is one luxury for them, that of human relations. We find meaning in our relations with other human beings. He says, how can one fail to realize that in this vulnerable universe, everything that is human and solely human assumes a more vivid meaning? Taut faces, threatened fraternity, strong and chaste friendship among men. These are true riches. Why? Not because they are eternal values. They are transitory. It is their very transitoriness that makes them valuable. He says, in their midst, the mind is most aware of its powers and limitations, its efficacy, its ability to do something, even if just for a moment. And then he says something that I really like. Some have spoken of genius, but genius is easy to say. I prefer the intelligence, right? It lights up this desert and dominates it. It knows its obligations and illustrates them. Genius is a throwaway term that so many people use in the present. They just blather on about it. Camus is saying, hey, in my own time, people are using this. What I prefer is to see people thinking things through their action, not some mythical genius thing that is basically just for PR people and public consumption. And then he's going to say, we're not ignorant of the fact that all churches are against us, and all churches, divine or political, lay claim to the eternal. Happiness and courage, retribution or justice are secondary ends for them. It's a doctrine they bring. We're interested in happiness and courage, retribution and justice, but we're not going to see those happen entirely within the lifetime we have, and we're not going to get another lifetime after this where those are going to happen either. And so he says, at the end of everything is death. Death and graveyards. So, what should we make of these? He's going to contrast ugly and beautiful graveyards against each other. And he says that people beautify what they love and death repels us. So, he goes on and he says, in the rebels universe, this is a very interesting line, death exalts injustice. It is the supreme abuse. Death of many who have that death imposed on them, taking away all of their possibilities. Death of even the conqueror, who is going to die like everybody else. Then he goes on and he talks about others without compromising have chosen the eternal and denounced the illusion of this world. Their cemeteries smile amidst numerous flowers and birds. And he says the conqueror is fine with that. They don't need to destroy that. That gives them an image of what it is that they've actually rejected. They've chosen the black iron fence or the potter's field. The potter's field is where people are buried who are paupers or not identified. You could also say it's where the soldiers or revolutionaries often get buried as well. There's no memory of them, and the conqueror is okay with them winding up there because that is a certain sort of solidarity with everybody else. He says that The best among the men of God sometimes are seized with fright, mingled with consideration and pity for minds that can live with such an image of their death. Our fate stands before us, and we provoke God, Him, less out of pride than out of awareness of our ineffectual condition. So the conqueror winds up being somebody very different than what we might at first imagine. We could actually call them the committed person of action. That might be a better title, but Camus is choosing this to, you might say, revalue and have us rethink what it is to be a conqueror in this modern, mobilized, mechanized age, which is marked by awareness of the absurd.